30 chapters in our Bibles on the Holy Week. And we're now drilling down into a Tuesday that really does span quite a few chapters. As a matter of fact, and it seems as though that on Tuesday, we cover the territory from Matthew 21, verses 18, all the way to the end of Matthew 23. That's quite a bit of discourse by Jesus. In Mark, it covers from Mark 11, 27, all the way to Mark 12, 44. And in Luke, we have all of Luke 20, as well as the first 4 verses of Luke 21. But what I want to look at now is Jesus having entered into the temple courts with, oh my goodness, with such style, really, to come in humble, but yet powerful. Meekness is power under control. And my goodness, that was Jesus entering in through the east gate. But now, by the way, this is Revolution Week. This is the week where Israel was released from the bondage of bricks without straw slavery in Egypt, and the momentous event of all of their history. And it is celebrated, of course, with a beautiful feast here in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of the Passover, and people would be engaging with one another as Jerusalem explodes tenfold in population, maybe from 100,000 to 1 million, all now thronging together, celebrating Jesus as he comes in, interacting with Jesus, learning from Jesus, contending with Jesus, depending on what side of the arguments that you might be on. But starting in verse 27, it says, "And they came again to Jerusalem," and that's the marker that we're in a new day. "And as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him, and they said to him, 'By what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you this authority to do them?'" Some sort of an ethos or street cred or corroboration, commendation seemed to be a big deal among the Pharisees and the scribes and the teachers of the law. And this kind of idea of your cred and your legacy and your schooling would have been really some of what they were asking for from Jesus, because they deemed him to be somewhat of a self-taught, autodidact rabbi, itinerant rabbi, that in their minds was blowing himself up to be something so much more than he should have been doing. And by the way, in the history of the world, there have been many people that have gained a great following after themselves. There have also been a great number of people who have claimed to be God himself. Not a vessel of God, but God himself. And what's interesting is, if you overlap the two lists of people that both have had an enduring, massive following and a claim that they were God, the overlap of those two circles overlaps on just Jesus. There's no one else that makes the claim to be God that has an enduring following. And of all those with an enduring following, there's no one else that claims to be God. That's maybe it isn't like proving overly too much, but I think it does say something rather radical. That if you're setting yourself up for that, do you have followers that are really all in as they get to know your life? And so Jesus has street cred way beyond what they could imagine. He has a following that is undeniable, and now in their worry, they're trying to kind of poke at it a bit. So they say, "What's your authority? What's your authority for all that you've been doing?" Because he just cleansed the temple. Right? He just kicked them all out from what they were doing. And you're like, how do you where's your badge? But the cool thing is that Jesus comes in, and it would be like somebody today just coming into Washington, D.C. and saying, "Hey, don't worry about the State Department. I'll issue you a passport. I got you." And it's as if somebody just comes in and presumes that they can issue passports for the U.S. of A. And Jesus here is basically saying something so far beyond that. I have the authority. This is my house, and I'm setting up shop here. And now I'm going to then help school you on everything that you don't even understand about your very place and your very God. Wow. What chutzpah that he has as he comes into these temple courts. So Jesus says to them, after they ask him about authority, all right, instead of answering, I love what he does. And again, the rabbi verbal jujitsu is at its peak here. This is some of my favorite content in all the Bible as I view Jesus, because he's got it going on. Jesus said to them, I'm going to ask you a question. Answer me, and then I'll tell you what authority I do these things. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me. Now, why is this such a brilliant question? Well, because, and it is explained here, John had street cred. John had authority. Everyone recognized John to be someone rather amazing and great. John was a martyr at the hands of that monster pretender to the throne, Herod, King Herod. John was the one that was then revered. John was the one as a martyr who was exalted even higher in this moment. And now Jesus then puts it to them. John's baptism, where was it from? From heaven or from man? And they discussed it with one another, because they're not just going to answer because everything is political for them. And they discussed it with one another saying, all right. So scenario A, if we say from heaven, well, then he's going to say, why then didn't you believe in him? It's kind of like, all right, if we make, rook to pawn 5, then he's going to do this. Right? So if we say from heaven, then he's going to say, well, then why didn't you believe him? But shall we say from man? They were afraid of the people. That is to degrade John in such a way as that. Should we say from man? They were afraid of the people, for they all held that John really was a prophet. So Jesus backed them into a corner masterfully with a simple question. And at the end of it, what did they do? We don't know. And Jesus said to them, well then, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. Boom. Mic drop number 1. But it happens again and again. And it's really amazing. Then he begins to tell, parables at this point. Then he begins to tell a series of parables. And the parables are different from his parables earlier in his ministry. Those parables talked more about the kingdom of God. The parables on the Temple Mount during Holy Week, especially Mic Drop Tuesday parables, these were parables that were basically insurrection, judgment parables against the powers that be. And the first one is about the vineyard and the tenants and the stone that was rejected. And as a result of it, verse 12, it says, and they were seeking to arrest him, but they feared the people, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them. So they left him and went away. So again, parable was so powerful, but nonetheless, even in the midst of that, all people can do is just back on off. Now, after that, and this is maybe one of my favorite stories in all the gospel, in Luke, it begins with this. And we're going to look at this whole issue of them trying to trap him, of asking him about, should we pay taxes or not? Should we pay the tribute to Caesar or not? Now again, we of course are in Mark 12, verse 13. But let me just give you a little bit of rounding out, because all three, Matthew, Mark, Luke, all three of them deal with this issue and have a lot of interesting content. But Luke in particular has some here. Let me read this to you from Luke 20, 19 to 20. It says, the scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable that we just looked at against them. But they feared the people. So they watched him, and they sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. So now they're hoping to leverage Pilate and be able to bring Jesus into a place where he is compromised. And so, verse 13, we'll pick it up in Mark. And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. And we know from Luke's content that these are spies, crafty. They have been observing and waiting for an opportune time, and now they strike. And what are they trying to do? Trap Jesus. And they came to him and said, Teacher, we know you are true. You don't care about anyone's opinion, For you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not, or to pay the tribute? Should we pay them, or should we not? Now, look at who's here. Herodians and Pharisees. If Jesus says to them, you know what? You shouldn't pay them. The Pharisees are going to be pleased by that because the Pharisees hate the Romans. The Herodians are kind of like, well, we're kind of okay with the Romans. And as a matter of fact, if you say don't pay it, well, then we're going to go report you to the Romans right away. So damned if you do, damned if you don't situation in which they've placed Jesus at this very moment between the Pharisees and the Herodians. And it's a pretty good gambit on their part of this rabbinical back and forth. Verse 15, here it comes. What's Jesus to do? Maddening crowds, tension, heightened everywhere. In verse 15, cool as a cucumber, but knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, why are you putting me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. Now, that is a really clever thing that Jesus just said. Why? Because, we'll see, on a denarius, it would have, all coins, by the way, all coins that are unearthed during this time period in the Roman Empire would have an image, an engraved image of the emperor, and always a description of that emperor either being God or the Son of God, which would have been anathema, blasphemy, repulsive to any Jew. And for any Jew to even have a denarius on his person in the temple courts would also have been scandalous. But they're so caught up in testing him that Jesus just kind of puts it out there casually. Hey, anybody have one of those tribute coins here? Let me see it as I ponder this thing. So eager to trap him that they expose themselves, which is so cool. Oh, wait, here you go. Oh, it's like, he got me. But got him even worse because look what goes on here. He says, and they brought him one. Bum, 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 bum. And he said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? I've already described that. And they said to him, Caesar's. Jesus said to them, wait for it. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marveled at him. Now, before I finished on this, the word render is in the ESV, and it's a very good translation because render means this idea of reconcile back the goods that belong to that person. And I think maybe different translations say give back rather than just give. Give back, render back, set things right. Stuff that shouldn't be yours, give it back to the appropriate person. And I love how Jesus says this. Render back stuff that isn't yours, that shouldn't even be on your person. Get rid of it. Get rid of the stuff that's not appropriate to be yours and give it back to Caesar. Ah, yes, but also render to God what is God's. And what has God given us? Everything. Life and breath and everything else, as Paul will later say in Acts 17. And they marveled at him. And again, the way that Luke closes this out in verse 26 of Luke 20, and they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him and what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. Mic drop. This is a beautiful one. One time after another, with everybody coming in, trying to catch him, trying to debate, mic drop again and again. And then one more let's look at. And the Sadducees came to him. This is a new group. The Sadducees are the ruling class. They are the compromisers with Rome as well, but they are those that are those who constitute the high priesthood. They would be the corrupt inner circle of power among Jews. And the Sadducees came to him, who say there is no resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife, but leaves no child, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. So there were 7 brothers. First took a wife, died no offspring. Second took her, died no offspring. Third, likewise, 7, no offspring. Last of all, the woman died. In the resurrection, when they rise again, whose wife will she be? For the 7 had her as a wife. And Jesus said to them, is this not the reason you are wrong? I love it. They're trying to kind of trap him and confuse him in all of this. And he immediately heads right into it. Here is your error. Here is your ignorance. This is the reason you're so wrong. Because you don't know the scriptures or even the power of God. And then Jesus pulls out a scripture that is hiding in plain sight that would have been familiar to everyone there, from the youngest child to the oldest man that still had enough sense to be able to grasp scriptures. Hiding in plain sight. He says, you are in error because you don't know the scriptures or the power of God. For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but they're like angels in heaven. And as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses in the passage about the bush? Yes, they had, by the way. It's Passover week. They would have been reading it all week long. This is the Exodus. This is the Passover. Haven't you read about what Moses said? Saying to him, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. You are quite wrong. And again, I'm going to interject a little bit from the other Gospels. Luke adds here, then some of the scribes answered, Teacher, you have spoken well, for they no longer dared to ask him any question. Wow. Jesus will go on to give incredible insights into Psalm 110, to be able to give an incredible insight in how you were to look at the law itself, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second great commandment is just like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. In all of this, he is leaving the people dumbfounded. And as they come to attack him, he is beyond reproach. It is like them taking aim at him only to have BBs firing off of a tank. And all the while, every moment, the people marvel. And the critics have their mouths shut. And time again, we get to marvel at our Jesus, who is so brilliant under fire, so composed despite chaos, and so determined to make sure that scriptures really rise above the fray of all the nonsense that they want to try to debate in the midst of all of this. And he brings such clarity as they try to bring confusion. And I love that we are left with this simple clarity at the end of this. You know what all of this hangs on? Love God. Love God and love everybody else. Everything hangs on those two things. And now that I've kind of cleared the room and I have a moment to be able to bring this to you, love God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your strength. And the other is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Boom. Elvis has left the building until we see Jesus on yet another amazing day as he brings more incredible teaching during Holy Week, which we'll have posted on YouTube tomorrow.